Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The Associated Student Speakers Program is very proud to welcome Mr. Antony Grey, the Executive Secretary of the Homosexual Law Reform Society and the Albany Trust, both in London. It was these organizations which, between them, have enlisted the support and membership of leading British figures, including, beginning with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Bertrand Russell, and a whole roster of similarly distinguished persons. The work of these organizations was largely responsible for bringing about the final adoption by Parliament late this past summer of the main recommendations of the famed Wolfenden Committee report. Mr. Grey, by virtue of his position with these organizations, played a key role in this notable legal reform. He was educated at Cambridge University, and afterwards, after his graduation that is, he read for the bar. His special interests lie in the fields of social work and civil liberties, and he is also the co-author of a 2-volume work on industrial history. Following Mr. Gray's presentation dealing with homophile relationships in our society, we will be having a short coffee break, and following that we'll have a question and answer period. Now, speaking on sex, morality, and happiness, Mr. Antony Grey.
Well, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful for that introduction because when I arrived here and saw the notice, which didn't make any mention of the fact that I'd been primarily concerned with one aspect of sex, happiness and morality, I felt I would have to give a rather more impromptu talk than the one that I've been delivering to various church groups and others while I've been going around the States. But I think after all I can stick rather more closely to my brief, but I will say a number of broader things which I hope will stimulate discussion, because while I have been concerned primarily with matters relating to changing the law about homosexuals and helping homosexuals with their various problems, I've come to realize very clearly in doing this that when you're counseling people and advising people and trying to help people to sort out their ideas about sex and morality and happiness and religion and politics and law and all these sort of things, you're really dealing substantially with the same sort of problems, whatever the sexual orientation of the person you're trying to help. And I think a great deal of what one learns and what one tries to teach in helping people applies equally to all of us as human beings, rather than as homosexuals or heterosexuals or bisexuals or whatever we may be. I would like to say, if I may, how very grateful I am to Los Angeles for the fact that I'm here at all, because my visit to the States was sponsored by One Incorporated in Los Angeles and by the Erickson Educational Foundation in New York. And they have arranged a very admirable and comprehensive tour for me. In fact, it was so comprehensive it nearly killed me off in New York in the first 5 days, because I spent 5 days doing a sort of 18-hour stint rushing from place to place, and they seemed to think if there was 5 minutes break between engagements they'd failed in some way. But anyway, I managed to escape from that and relax a little bit in Chicago. And I then went down to Bloomington and visited the Kinsey Institute, where they opened some of their locked cupboards and showed us some of the things they've unearthed in Peru and elsewhere. And now here I am on the West Coast, and I'm going on to San Francisco and Washington before I go home to England. So I have learned a great deal, and I hope that I have been able to assist a little in informing people in America who are interested in this field what we have been doing in England and the way we think about these things. Because I am a journalist, and I understand what journalists tend to do. There's been a great deal of rather bogus and artificial stuff written and printed about the sexual revolution and morals on the campus and all this sort of thing. I don't think people are all that different, except that perhaps both at home and here, people, especially young people, are ready to be much franker and more matter-of-fact in their approach to sex and sexual matters, and to try to get down to brass tacks a little more, and not to deceive themselves quite so much about the way they feel and behave. I don't know whether any of you have read a very excellent book by Alex Comfort, which is available as a paperback in Penguin, called Sex in Society. And he says a number of very wise and sensible things in that, one of which is that, of course, sex is a subject for intellectual and rational study just as much as anything else, and that before we can think about it sensibly we have to deflate its emotional currency, never forgetting, of course, that it does concern our deepest emotions and is about love and human relationships as much as about physical behavior. Another thing which he said, which I think is strikingly true, is that one of the most regrettable achievements of Christendom has been to make sex into a problem, because nearly all our taboos and restrictions and difficulties and guilt feelings about sex stem in one way or another from ancient religious precepts. Nevertheless, we are saddled with these, and in our Western society we can't escape from them or simply ignore them, even though some people consciously reject them. And I think it is encouraging that one of the big things which has happened in England over the past 4 or 5 years, and is probably happening here too, is that the committed Christians in the churches of nearly all denominations are coming to recognize that the old traditional Christian attitudes towards sex, which mainly center around the biblical "thou shalt not," are quite inadequate in helping people to cope with the problems that are really worrying them, and that one has got to try and initiate a new thinking at a theological level as well as at a more personal level, so that the churches can have something more acceptable and constructive to say to people who don't fit into the standard sexual pattern. We in England are so accustomed to being regarded as socially backward by our economically emancipated Western cousins that it comes as a pleasant shock to find ourselves apparently way ahead of America in our legal, social and religious thinking about sexual laws and attitudes. For while in England, since we passed our new law about homosexuality in July, there is only one form of sexual misconduct, namely incest, which remains a crime. In most of the United States, to quote one of your eminent legal authorities, a quick glance at the maze of laws that concern sex and sexual behavior may well justify the conclusion that sex itself is not legal. And in this article by Robert Veet Sherwin in the Encyclopedia of Sexual Behavior, he proceeds to examine the state of US laws about sex and infers that the only safe advice to anyone, even if they're husband and wife, who wish to perform any sexual act at all other than normal copulation within marriage, is don't, because any variation from this, even between married people, is restricted in all states under one law or another. I must say that I can't help feeling that for you in the United States, the problem of, as far as the law is concerned, is not so much one of dealing particularly with homosexuality. It is a problem for everybody. It's really a matter of reforming the laws about sex in general, because your existing laws in nearly every state would appear to make criminals of 95% of the population, while the other 5% are probably lying. I haven't been deported yet for saying what I dreamt up in the plane, sort of reading articles and thinking about all this, that these extraordinarily comprehensive puritanical laws which you've got seem like the result of a sort of incestuous union between the Pilgrim Fathers and the Daughters of the Revolution. So as I said, we in Britain had a simpler problem, but in another way it was more difficult, because homosexuality is the point at which some of the most violent common prejudices about sex are concentrated. People get very hot under the collar about homosexuals and sometimes even foam at the mouth about them. But of course these people are very unwilling to engage in rational discussion. It's been rather an education for me in working for nearly 10 years on this problem to find how very infrequently one actually meets face to face somebody who is very hostile about homosexuality and is prepared to discuss it. They sometimes won't even come into the same room with somebody, even if he's an archbishop, who says that the laws on the subject are wrong or that attitudes should be revised and so forth. Most of the abusive letters and the angry letters that were received by people campaigning for law reform tended to be anonymous. I always remember one which reached us, which consisted of a string of really obscene epithets and diatribes, and ended up by saying, I would like to sign my name to this letter, but people like me have to be protected from people like you. Which did strike me as rather comic, because if he had signed his name to the letter, he'd probably been prosecuted for sending an obscene communication through the post. But now we have changed our laws. This is all part of a general trend in England, which is not quite so apparent to me as yet, at any rate, in the United States, because there's been this great deal of discussion in the churches, which I will speak of in more detail in a few minutes. We've also just liberalized our abortion laws, which I believe is also the case here in California. I happened to hear a news item about this morning on the radio. We are considering further changes in our divorce laws, which haven't been modified for the past 30 years or so. There is a much more liberal attitude on the part of the government itself to giving contraceptive advice even to unmarried people nowadays. And sex education is definitely not merely at the biological instruction level, but much more at the human relations level. And all this, in some people's eyes, adds up to an absolutely dire state of affairs. They feel that we are creating what they call the Permissive Society. They always use this in a very derogatory sense, because they think that things are becoming too tolerant and all the old values and standards which they felt certain about are being swept away. And I think that even those of us who believe that these changes are good and that liberalism in these matters and rethinking in these matters is necessary, have to ask ourselves whether we are in danger of rushing down a Gadarene slope into decadence, or whether we are merely becoming more honest and less hypocritical and readier to accept life's realities where sex is concerned. And of course the basic clash in this area is between individual liberty and authoritarian morals. It isn't sufficient, I don't think, to attempt to legislate or to stop other people doing something simply because you feel disgusted by it. We have to legislate with our heads and our minds, and sometimes, I hope, with our hearts, but not with our stomachs if we can help it. And while these questions are in no sense party political, I sometimes think it's a trifle odd how both in our country and yours that there are many people who are the ruggedest individualists in their political and economic outlook, and who are always dead against government interference or state interference with their freedom to make money or to spend it as they want or to do as they please with their own possessions. And yet these people are very often the ones who campaign most hotly against free choice in moral values or in matters of sex, and they attempt to tell other people what they should and should not do with their bodies and minds. And as I say, I think this is perhaps because their own safe assumptions are threatened. Now, the Wolfenden Committee, which recommended in 1957 that the law should be changed as regards homosexuality so that consenting adults in private were no longer subject to the law, examined very thoroughly the sort of arguments which are usually put up against freedom in these matters by its opponents. The contentions that the moral fabric of society will be damaged unless the law upholds private moral standards, that family life will be threatened, and so on. And having examined and discounted all these arguments because they said they didn't apply to male homosexuality any more than they applied to fornication or adultery, and that obviously any attempt in Britain in the 20th century to make fornication and adultery into crimes just simply wouldn't be tolerated, the Wolfenden Committee went on to say that, in their view, there was one decisive counter-argument, which was that of individual responsibility. That, in fact, freedom means freedom to choose, and, of course, freedom to choose means freedom to choose the wrong thing as well as freedom to choose the right thing, which I think is something we all always have to remember. And the committee said that unless a deliberate attempt is to be made by society, acting through the agency of the law, to equate the sphere of crime with that of sin, there must remain a realm of private morality and immorality, which is, in brief and crude terms, not the law's business. And they went on to say this is not to condone or to encourage private immorality, on the contrary, to emphasize the personal and private nature of moral or immoral conduct is to emphasize the personal and private responsibility of the individual for his own actions. And that is a responsibility which a mature agent can properly be expected to carry for himself without the threat of punishment from the law. The discussion which the Wolfenden Committee sparked off as to the need and desirability of reforming our completely prohibitive homosexuality laws, and which led to the formation of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, has played a very large part in educating the general public back at home about not only homosexuality, but indeed about sex in general. There's been far more discussion of all these matters in the press and on the radio and the television over the last 10 years than there ever was before. And a good deal of this discussion has been of pretty high quality and of a moderate and temperate and reasonable tone. And it's also promoted some very interesting discussions and philosophical debates among lawyers, philosophers and theologians about the entire relationship of law and morality and about the nature of morality itself. One of our judges, called Lord Devlin, published a lecture on the enforcement of morals in which he contended that society has a theoretical right to enforce private morality on individuals even when they do consenting acts, because if society didn't do this, you would have complete pluralism of values and society would no longer have any cohesion. And this was very strongly countered by a professor of jurisprudence at Oxford, Professor Hart, who has written some comprehensive and devastating criticisms of this argument. And while I think one can argue from now until doomsday about the theory of the thing, one obviously has to take a stand on its practice. And even Lord Devlin admitted that while it may be theoretically all right for the state to interfere in people's private moral behavior, usually on balance this did more harm than good. And he indeed in the end supported the change in the law publicly, which has just been made about male homosexuality. And my own view on this is that whatever the theory may be, the practice usually does more harm than good when you're considering individuals and their lives and behavior, because dragging people into court for immoral sexual behavior or behavior which you may think is wrong and punishing them isn't likely really to help them to reform or desist or get over whatever their problems are. It merely makes them much more bitter and antisocial than they otherwise might be. And on the church level, we've had the so-called New Morality movement of South Bank theologians, the people who wrote Towards a Quaker View of Sex, the Bishop of Woolwich and his various colleagues, who have created a distinct new school of theological thinking, which has been a serious attempt to reconsider the basic gospel message and apply it to sexual and moral behavior. And while we may not agree with all of what these people say, I think we have to respect their sincerity. I don't know whether any of you have read Towards a Quaker View of Sex, but if you haven't done, and I'm sure it's in the libraries here, it's quite a short pamphlet of about 60 or 70 pages, which is extremely thought-provoking and certainly broke new ground on these matters. It's got one of the best chapters on homosexuality that I know, and it's also extremely good on sexual growing up generally and marital relations and so forth. Now I'd like to quote the basic passage in their introductory chapter where this group state their basic approach to the whole question. They say it's been the tradition of the greater part of the Christian Church to lay down firm rules as to conduct and to fix a definite pattern as to what is moral or sinful, while being humanely tolerant of the waywardness and sinfulness of the ordinary man. It might be claimed that there is practical wisdom in this, but our group felt compelled to question the whole basis of judgment as to what is right and what is wrong. Sexuality, looked at dispassionately, is neither good nor evil. It is a fact of nature and a force of immeasurable power. But looking at it as Christians, we have felt impelled to state without reservation that it is a glorious gift of God. Throughout the whole living nature, it makes possible an endless and fascinating variety of creatures, a lavishness, a beauty of form and colour surpassing all that could be imagined as necessary to survival. But like every gift of God, it can be misused, and when it is misused, the degradation to which men and women can be lowered reflects the heights to which they might be raised by its proper enjoyment. It seemed to us that morals, like the Sabbath, were made for man, not man for morals, and that as society changes, and modes of conduct with it, we must always be searching below the surface of human behaviour to discover what is in fact happening to people, what they are seeking to express, what motives and intentions they are satisfying, what fruits, good or bad, they are harvesting. And they went on to say that while many people might be disturbed at an apparent acceptance of contemporary weakening of moral codes, they felt it necessary to state emphatically what their positive hopes for men and women in society were. They said that a moral code, even when accepted for the best of reasons, necessarily tends to be negative rather than positive, to be concerned with thou shalt not rather than with what an individual should give to his fellows. We are much concerned about the whole content of human relationship, about the meaning of thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself in the full range and depth of its implications. Loving doesn't merely mean doing good works. It goes further than feeding the hungry and clothing the naked. It means warmth and intimacy, open-heartedness and overwhelming generosity of hand and spirit. It means a desire to know and a courageous willingness to be known. Loving implies commitment to the other person, involvement in that person's life, whatever it may cost in suffering, whether that suffering comes through being repudiated or through identification and sharing. And they went on to say that they felt they had to ask themselves various questions which Christians normally took for granted, because if Christianity was a true faith, there could be no ultimate contradiction between what it demanded and what in practice worked towards complete human fulfillment. This necessarily rules out irresponsible promiscuity, but we have no hesitation in taking every now and then an empirical approach. We ask, for instance, whether homosexual contacts are really unnatural or repulsive, whether premarital intercourse is necessarily always a bad preparation for marriage, and whether to have a variety of sexual partners does in fact weaken intimate relations and destroy a community. They went on to say they hadn't found the answers to many of these questions because a small group, however long it continued its work, couldn't find all the answers, but that some of their members had found themselves compelled to surrender assumptions that they had long accepted as good and right, because the emphasis on morality had so often gone with a cold and inhibitive attitude. And they said that they felt that the sort of morality that included a vehement and categorical condemnation of homosexuals wasn't Christian, because it lacked compassion for the individual person and it lacked understanding of the human problem. And they went on, was it equally recognized that heterosexual morality, the morality of marriage and family life, though believed in with conviction, might be defensive and insensitive in many instances. The state of mind that ensures loyalty to the marriage partner may in fact shut other people out from the warmth and friendship they need. Morality may involve fear and rejection. Among the married, faithfulness may be achieved by working to rule, but at the cost of depth and understanding. Among the unmarried, chastity may be upheld at the cost of charity, and at the cost of an unwillingness to give or to understand. So they really broke new ground in general thinking about morality, quite apart from what they said about homosexuality. And what they said about homosexuality was very clear and definite, that they did not think that the standards of judgment which you should apply to homosexual acts were any different to what to the ones which you apply to heterosexual acts, because it was the nature and quality of a relationship that mattered, and one had to judge it by this and not by its external incidentals, and that homosexual affection could be as selfless as heterosexual affection, and therefore this group couldn't see that it was in some way morally worse. They said that, of course, homosexual affection might be an emotion which some found aesthetically disgusting, but one cannot base Christian morality on a capacity for disgust. Neither are we happy with the thought that all homosexual behaviour is sinful. Motive and circumstances degrade or ennoble any act, and we feel that to list sexual acts as sins is to follow the letter rather than the spirit, to kill rather than to give life. But they went on in their section on homosexuality to say that they were disturbed by the complete abandon and irresponsibility of many homosexuals as much as by the condemnation rained down upon the well-behaved by the too self-righteous. But equally, I think they would have taken the view, which I do, that the latter probably makes a considerable contribution to causing the former. I have found in my own work as a counsellor that there are, of course, some very unpleasant and depraved and heartless homosexuals, just as there are many unpleasant and depraved and heartless heterosexuals. And equally, one encounters many people who are homosexual, who are extremely sincere and genuine and worthwhile people, who are seeking, just as much as anybody else is, to form really affectionate and truly loving relationships with other people. And it is, in fact, impossible to generalize about the morality of sexuality, whether it's homosexual or heterosexual. And in my view, it's even less possible to judge people, because our individual natures and characters are so different. Our physical makeup, our emotional needs, our religious beliefs, our moral principles, all interact on one another. And things which are absolutely compulsive and necessary for some people and irresistible are for other people extremely repulsive and disgusting. But it is unfortunate, I think, that those who often take a rather censorious and rigid view of these matters tend to find themselves sitting in the seats of judgment upon other people whose temptations and needs and life situations they really are often quite unable to comprehend. And this, of course, is where the tragic situations arise, where people get involved in quite unmanageable situations, even leading them to suicide or to complete breakdowns or to the loss of their jobs or to rejection by their families and so on and so forth. And that is why I do take this very strong attitude that the law as such usually does more harm than good when it deals with sexual matters and personal behavior. In the Albany Trust, which is a registered charity to promote psychological health and which deals with the social service side of our work, we have, over the past 4 or 5 years, counselled many hundreds of people. Most of them are homosexuals. A good many of them aren't. We get a lot of people coming to us with the sort of problems that you can't find any other ready outlet for in society, because for one thing, of course, psychiatry is not so prominent in England as it is here. We probably have fewer psychiatrists per head of the population. The idea of going to a psychiatrist is viewed with rather less favour by many people in England than it is in America. One is regarded as a little odd if one has a psychiatrist, whereas I sometimes feel reading about and talking to Americans that they might regard themselves as a little odd if they didn't have a psychiatrist. But we find again that among the psychiatrists there's considerable discrepancies of view about all these various matters. We don't have one very strongly dominant school such as psychoanalysis. We have much more broad eclectic approaches. And in general, the feeling about sexual problems about homosexuality is that it is not an illness or a disease which can or should be cured, that while there are a number of people who may be bisexual or just passing through a homosexual phase who can be adjusted and helped towards a more heterosexual way of life, in the majority of cases, by the time people reach at any rate their late teens or early 20s, if they are strongly or exclusively homosexual, they're likely to remain this way for the rest of their lives, and that therefore the practical thing to do is to help them to adjust to living as happily and as constructively as they can. And this, of course, involves one in counselling them about human relationships first and foremost. Because we live in a heterosexually orientated world, it's very difficult indeed for somebody who is homosexual to fit into this world when all the pressures of not only of law and of morality and of orthodox religion and of family, but also of advertising and commercial pressures are all the time towards heterosexual sex and marriage and family life and so forth. The homosexual person inevitably feels him or herself to be an odd man out and gets neurotic or very repressed about it. and they tend to live in, at any rate, a mental ghetto, even if they don't live in a societal ghetto. A lot of the differences are, in fact, exaggerated inside the homosexual person's own mind as a result of their experience of these pressures and their feelings about them. But I myself feel that the great aim is to help them to realize that they are not all that different from other people, and perhaps more important, to help the rest of us to realize that just because a man or a woman happens to be homosexual or bisexual, he's not all that different from those of us who are not. And this is perfectly possible to do, but it does demand re-education all round and rethinking and much greater acceptance of people as people. You see, whether a person happens to be attracted wholly or mainly to their own sex rather than to the opposite sex doesn't affect the sort of person they are in other areas of life. They may be intelligent or dim, they may be honest or utterly unscrupulous, they may be useful members of society or not. And I think it's unfortunate that this sexual component is so often elevated into the most important thing about them, both in their own thinking and in other people's. Of course, the very word homosexual tends to encourage this. It is, in fact, a sort of bastard Latin and Greek word. It is an adjective which we use as a noun. If we always thought about homosexual men, homosexual women, homosexual people, it would be much better, but we don't. We talk about homosexuals and we think about their sexual activities and behavior before we think about all the rest of them. We don't do this about heterosexuals. It might be salutary if we started writing in our newspapers, Mrs. Smith, 42, heterosexual housewife, was fined for dangerous driving last week. People would immediately imagine Mrs. Smith in various compromising sexual situations. But of course we don't do this. And when it comes to Mr. X, who is a homosexual, and that fact becomes known, it becomes regarded by many people as the only important and relevant fact about him. And of course it isn't. He may be a very shy and retiring and almost completely celibate person. He may be a deeply romantic person, or he may be an utterly promiscuous person. And we ought not to jump to any conclusions at all about him. One of the great evils, of course, of this indiscriminate attitude is that it makes it much harder for people who are not able to get married, whether heterosexually or homosexually, to contemplate restraint and chastity and celibacy on their merits, because if they're told that everything that they do is wrong and illegal, it really ceases to matter to many of them whether they're hung for a sheep or a lamb, and they feel, well, I can't ever attain to or establish a worthwhile relationship which will be acceptable to most of society, and so I might just as well throw in the sponge and have what fun I can when I can and be indiscriminately promiscuous. And this, of course, very often leads to great loneliness. There are many moral arguments against promiscuity, but in my view the main arguments against promiscuity are the practical ones, that it doesn't lead to happiness either for heterosexuals or homosexuals. I think the person who is completely satisfied with nothing but promiscuity, enjoyable as it may be, is basically usually a rather shallow and very self-centered and selfish sort of person, because unless one is prepared to at least make the effort to build up some fairly deep relationship and long-term relationship with other people, one is going to go through life in a very self-enclosed and rather inadequate way. And we have found in our work that the commonest problem which people bring to us is that of loneliness. Now, loneliness, as a very experienced social worker friend of mine at St. Martin's in the Fields in London said in a recent broadcast, is a sort of portmanteau word which is often used by distressed people to cloak or conceal, even from themselves, a deeper problem. It's a sort of catchphrase, and you say to somebody, what's wrong with you? And they say, oh, I'm lonely. And then you have to spend half an hour finding out why they're lonely. But even so, it is still a very real phenomenon which is experienced by a great many human beings, certainly by a great many homosexuals. And as I said, it's one of the most common single complaints of the people who come to us for help and counselling. Many of them, especially the young people who have just grown up into the experience of realizing that they're different from other people because they're attracted to their own sex rather than the opposite sex, experience a conscious severance from society to an almost unbearable degree, until quite often they're unable to make any really meaningful contacts with other people. I know one mustn't generalize, and that there are many happy and gregarious homosexuals as well as unmarried heterosexuals who achieve stable partnerships even outside marriage. And it may be that those of us who go in for social work see an undue proportion of the others, the ones who are distressed and unbalanced and so on. But it is nevertheless the case that there's a great deal of neurosis and unhappiness around still, even in a society where we are perhaps more liberal in our thinking and talking about sexual matters than you are yet over here, among people who are homosexual for the simple reason that they don't feel that they can live openly enough and comfortably enough in society. One of the greatest needs, I think, of human beings and of churches and of societies is for greater openness towards one another. One of the most encouraging things which has been happening in England over the last year or two is that a lot of these young people are much readier to come along with their parents, or the parents bring the children to talk over this problem and try and reach some sort of understandings about it. Whereas usually the worst thing in the world for anybody who is homosexual is for their family to find out. Of course, you can often resolve a great many of the problems and give a much more constructive help to people if you can discuss this as a family problem. And in Holland, where there is a foundation working along these lines in cooperation with social workers and church people of various denominations, they've actually started having 2-day conferences for homosexuals and their families. And they find, of course, that the parents have got their problems about it and their guilt feelings and worries just as much as the homosexual person has, and that it needs 2 days of lectures and talks and discussions to get these people to begin to understand their various mutual problems and to go away feeling more able to establish some sort of communication with one another. I think, again, another sphere in sexual morality and behaviour generally, where we've all got to work for much more communication, is between the generations, because it is unfortunate that so many young people not only consciously reject what they conceive to be the values of older people, and the older people so often cease to attempt to understand what the younger people are getting at or want. And somehow or other, we've got to try and convince both these groups that the other is worth talking to. I hope this doesn't seem too idealistic, but and I hope it may not be the same to quite the extent here that it now is in England. Things go in phases and fashions. We were discussing before I started this talk what the fashionable topics were this year, and I said, well, I suppose sex is out because sex was last year, and this year it's probably more like Vietnam and drugs. And this tends to be the sort of situation, but you are still at the rather militant stage of going around waving banners and getting yourselves arrested for things. At home, your contemporaries at our universities are becoming much more quietist, and anarchism seems to be the fashion of the day, in the sense that they're withdrawing completely from political involvement and saying, well, we just give up the whole lot. They're such a load of showers, these older people that are running society, that we're going to contract out and just cultivate our own little gardens and take our degrees and enjoy our lives and have our fun, and to hell with all the causes. That is a point of view which I think is probably quite reasonable at some levels, but at other levels it's very dangerous if it's going to persist too long into the workaday world of adult life. And I myself find that I'm getting to the age, rather gallingly, where I am regarded as being quite out of it by my university friends when I try to talk to them about this sort of thing and point out that that attitude gets you so far and no further. As you will see from these rather rambling remarks, I believe in the essential similarity of human problems with regard to sex and morality and love and happiness, whether one is talking about heterosexuals or homosexuals. We're all people, and our problems are basically similar, as are those of other minorities. It seems to me that self-righteousness is the great enemy of happiness, that the best is the enemy of the good. that original sin is all very well as a concept, and it's a very useful thing to remember that there are some people around who are just sheerly or basically evil, and one tends to find out these people and avoid them. But equally, the other side of the coin is original goodness, which people don't talk about half so much. You can always find some good in somebody if you look deep enough for it, and if you're always automatically assuming that just because people differ from you in their sexual attitudes or relationships they must be evil, we're not going to create the sort of society which is fit for any of us to live in. And of course there are the other even deeper minority problems which are even more socially embarrassing. The problems of the transvestite, or the person who actually wishes to change sex because they feel that they have been born into the wrong sex and want to attain their true personalities. All these people do have really genuine and problems which are intensely real to them, and which call first and foremost for understanding and a degree of tolerance from us, if the emotional stress is to be relieved. We are all members one of another. As John Donne said, no man is an island. We must neither set ourselves apart in nor relegate others into sexual ghettos, for it's only, I believe, by ultimate integration and not by sexual apartheid that we shall all of us realize our humanity to the full. After all, integration is the goal of the anti-racist believer in civil rights, and I think it should be the goal of people working for more liberal attitudes to sex and morality and human behavior as well. Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, I've probably said enough to stimulate questions, and at that point I'd like to hand over to the floor.
Thank you. Some of you may wish to have some coffee. There is some coffee at the end of the room. Why don't we just go directly into a question and answer period for those of you that do have questions. Some water right here.
Thank you.
We start right with you.
Mr. Gray, what you said seemed to apply only to the male homosexual. Is the situation differ in England pertaining to the female homosexual?
The legal situation was quite different because there was no specific law against female homosexuality, and presumably 2 women over the age of 16, which is the age of consent for girls, who commit homosexual acts in private with consent aren't breaking the law. I think the social situation is in some ways similar. The pressures aren't so great from a legal point of view, of course, but I think a lot of female homosexuals feel that they have got acute problems in society simply because their problem is even less discussed and perhaps more ignored than that of the male homosexual. We did have a society which started about 2 or 3 years ago to publicise the situation of the female homosexual, and for the first time we started having articles in the press and so on about that too. But of course it is a situation in which many people find themselves or realise that they're in 2 or 3 or 4 or more years after marriage. And the people who started this organisation told me they were intensely surprised at the large numbers of married women who got in touch with them when they started publicising the work that they were doing. Well, I personally believe that things find their own level in the sense that, as the Kinsey surveys indicated, a very high proportion of people who would be the last to regard themselves as homosexual have at least an incidental homosexual experience. It doesn't affect their basic emotional attitudes. That there are probably a good many people who are overtly and consciously bisexual, so that in a more tolerant society you might have an increase in sort of interaction, as it were, bisexuality, but you won't have an increase in basically homosexual condition, because that is something which is a psychological conditioning process which takes place in very early childhood. And the researches which have been done all indicate there's a fairly steady percentage of about 4 or 5% of the population in every society which has been studied who are very largely homosexual. I think all that happens is if you're more tolerant in your laws and social attitudes, the fact that homosexuals exist and have social meeting places and so on becomes more apparent. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's any more homosexual behaviour.
What do you say the promiscuous homosexual, the self-centered
Mhm.
If it suits them like it.
Mhm. Well, I think this is a matter where personal choice has to enter into it. I hope I made it plain from what I said that I don't believe that one should use laws to express moral disapproval, and I think people who morally disapprove of promiscuity haven't got any stronger case for saying that the law should be applied than they have if it's in the case of two people having a lifelong relationship, as long as it's consenting adults in private. What I did say about promiscuity was that I think the main arguments against it are practical. In the most cases it doesn't make people really happy. It may be quite enjoyable for long periods, but I think everybody's got to find out for themselves, really. But all I was really saying was that while men are perhaps biologically and naturally more promiscuous than women anyway, and therefore male homosexuals will tend to be more promiscuous, one does seem to find that a lot of the people who come to us and to organisations like One Incorporated for advice and counselling are people who have sometimes been very promiscuous and are extremely unhappy and lonely because they don't really know anybody. They may get lots of sex and different bed partners, but they haven't got anybody that they've really got a deep friendship with. And so, I think this is a sort of practical consideration. Pardon?
That's probably not perhaps the average homosexual would come to, let's say, an organization for help.
One can't really tell. I don't know that there is such a thing as the average homosexual. I think people differ enormously in their temperaments and habits. Obviously, the majority of people don't come to social agencies of any kind for help. The majority of homosexuals probably don't, but equally I think that the majority of homosexuals are often very thoughtless sort of people. They never seem to consider that other people need this kind of help, and they're very slow at supporting organisations which give it. And yet these people are always the first to run along when they get into trouble and expect you to bail them out or help them, and they've never done a thing to support you. This is one of the crosses that social workers have to bear.
What distinguishes the promiscuous homosexual from I guess what you call a normal homosexual?
What distinguishes a promiscuous one from a normal one? Well, I don't know. What distinguishes a promiscuous heterosexual from a normal heterosexual? I think...
Heterosexual would be intercourse outside of marriage would be one thing, but as long as marriage isn't possible for a homosexual, then it seems like any homosexual activity would be permissible.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, I think that there are a much larger number of homosexuals than most people realise who do endeavour to set up long-term relationships and live together, and a lot of them live together for over long periods of years. I've known examples of these relationships lasting 10, 15, 20 years quite frequently. They are sometimes, but by no means always, completely sexually exclusive. But I mean, promiscuity is a matter of degree, isn't it? Some people would define a person as promiscuous who had ever had sex with more than one other person in their lives. Other people would define somebody as promiscuous who had sex with 10 different people a week. I mean, you can't really say what promiscuity is in that sense.
What was the public reaction in England, as much as you could determine, to the law?
Well, we worked for 10 years to condition public opinion, to make public opinion ready for this change in the law, because when the Wolfenden report was published, the government spokesman said, well, they recognised that it was a logical report and that the things which it recommended were very reasonable, but they didn't feel that public opinion was ready for it, even though polls taken at the time showed that about 40% of people accepted it. After about 5 or 6 years' work of very intensive campaigning and debates in Parliament and so on, we had 2 opinion polls at the end of 65, national polls, both of which showed that 63% of people thought that the law should be changed as regarded consenting adults in private. And so I would say that probably 2/3 to 3/4 of people now accept the idea that what grown-up people do with consent in private, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, should not be a crime, because this is an area where the state shouldn't interfere with people's personal freedom. Well, we were careful not to take stands on any of the various theoretical arguments, because we were a very broadly based society of people who agreed on one thing, namely that the law should be wrong. And when I went round talking, I used to try and state what the various views were on different matters. I mean, you'd have violent disagreements between the Freudians and the clinical psychologists, for instance, as to the nature of homosexuality and its origins and so forth. What one tries to do, as well as you can in the compass of a half-hour talk, is to give people these various theories and let them choose the one that suits them best.
I have a sort of a three-part question. As you mentioned, homosexuality is one of a number of aberrations, sexual aberrations.
Mm-hmm.
What have you, in your experience working with homosexuals, have you found that homosexuality is associated with other sexual aberrations or other forms of what society would call mental illness?
Mm-hmm.
Also, how far does this act go toward being permissive with any kind of acts of sexuality which could, say, violence, physical violence on another people?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you say is.
It isn't at all permissive to them. There's a special clause being put in which rules any assault connected with a homosexual act is still specifically illegal. But of course, mental illness is a subjective concept. I don't regard homosexuality as an illness. It's more of a deviation from the norm, or a condition like colourblindness or left-handedness, which doesn't impair the person's mental attitude or necessarily their moral attitude. But obviously you do get some homosexuals, just like you get some heterosexuals who are ill, who might have psychosis or schizophrenia or paranoia or whatever. And I mean, their homosexuality is sometimes irrelevant to this, sometimes it's part of a multiple personality condition. You know, the worries and the stresses and strains of being homosexual may have brought this on, but it's not in itself an illness. On all these other things, of course, I think we have to remember that sexuality is much more varied, and the things which people in fact do are far more, the whole spectrum of sexuality is much broader than we usually like to think, and that there are many, many different forms of gratification which are frowned upon, which are probably fairly normal, or at any rate not unhealthy. There's a book which was published here a year or two ago, which I've just written an introduction for the English edition of, called The Erotic Minorities by Olestam, a Swede, in which he pleads for far greater tolerance in Sweden for all sorts of sexual deviations like sadomasochists and exhibitionists and voyeurs and all this sort of thing. This is rather comic to us because, of course, the Swedes are far ahead in their legal and moral attitudes, and yet he writes as if their laws are as old-fashioned and reactionary as ours are. But it's an interesting book if you want to get an idea of the sort of attitudes to that type of behavior, even in an advanced Scandinavian country.
Have there been any ostensible abuses of the laws that you have?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Have there been any ostensible abuses that you
Abuses of the law. Well, of course, it was only changed in July. Do you mean have there been any cases brought under it which have been, which have sort of tried to violate its spirit? No, I don't think so. I think that we had very few prosecutions of consenting adults in private in the last 3 or 4 years before the law was changed, simply because we were working so hard to change it, and most people in Parliament and outside came to accept the fact that it would soon be changed, and so these prosecutions more or less ceased. Since the law was changed, of course, it doesn't affect public misbehaviour. It doesn't affect misbehaviour with people under 21. In fact, the penalties have been strengthened for some types of behaviour with people under 21. This is worrying to some of the liberals and reformers because we felt that the age of 21 was unrealistically high and that some of the penalties were rather severe, but these were the recommendations made by the Wolfenden Committee, and it didn't seem expedient to try and alter that report radically at this stage. What seemed important was to get a law through which, for the first time, provided that anybody who was homosexual was not automatically a criminal if he performed a homosexual act, at any rate in some circumstances, because then you can start getting people thinking about the whole thing more rationally. They don't automatically associate homosexuals with prison and that sort of thing.
I think that's about all the time we have. I certainly want to thank you very much, Mr. Gray, for coming and sharing your ideas and views with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very enjoyable.